Alright, we're going to do a lesson on how to maximize your score on the exam. Before we go too far, I first want to make it very clear what I mean by maximizing your score. So, maximizing your score refers to getting the most possible points on your exam. And when I say possible, I mean possible for you. So if you're somebody who knows about half of the material that is going to be asked on the exam, then you might be thinking, well, since I only know half of the material, then I'm only going to score 50 out of 100 on the exam. Well, that idea is wrong. In fact, if you know roughly about 50% of the content that is going to be asked on the exam, there's a good chance you can score much higher than 50% if you use some of the techniques that I'm going to cover here. Nothing I'm going to show you is considered to be illegal or unethical. These are all standard practices that the best students use on these exams. So if you want to compete with the best, then you have to learn the same techniques that everybody else is using. So let's jump right into the material. The first thing we want to discuss is the 4 types of questions you're likely going to face on any exam. In every exam you take, the questions will probably be you will probably be able to categorize the questions into one of 4 types. Questions for which you are confident that you know the answer because you have previously studied this material or for whatever reason the answer is obvious to you. Or questions which you have a rough idea but you're not certain about the answer. Third, you will sometimes encounter questions that you know absolutely nothing about, or even situations where you're running out of time and you don't have any time to actually look at the question. So even if it happens to be a question on a topic that you know, you don't have enough time to study it and get the right answer. Now, of course, if you're someone who has studied very well, then most of the questions you see on the exam are going to fall in category number 1. And you're likely going to do better than someone who hasn't studied very well. But that doesn't mean that you have no options when you run into a question that you know little or nothing about. So let's jump right into this and discuss the specific techniques you can use when you run into the various types of questions on any exam you take. The first thing is that you want to work on items that you know first. So if you are given 100 questions and you have done maybe the first 10 questions and you run into 1 or 2 in a row for which the answer seems a bit challenging, it's often smarter to skip ahead and go through all the ones that are easy so that you make sure that you have given yourself an opportunity to see all the questions that you are very confident about the answers for. Because for those ones, you are likely going to get close to 100% of those questions correctly. So the last thing you want is a situation where you run out of time and there's maybe 5 or 6 easy questions that you haven't yet even read. So skip ahead until you've done all the easy questions. Of course, you have to pay attention to the clock, make sure that you're not running out of time and so on. And you take advantage of your scrap paper, right? Your scrap paper is there so you can track questions that you ran into that maybe were not clear, and you can track those numbers, and then towards the end of the exam you might be able to come back to them. Now, depending on the level of practice you have, most people get somewhere between 65 to 80% of the questions that they felt very comfortable with correct. So even when you think that you really know a material, there's a chance you'll get some of those wrong as well. Now, there's really nothing new in what I just discussed. The category 1 questions are pretty straightforward. If you know the answer, you find the answer, you select that answer and you go forward. But what happens when you run into questions that you only have a rough idea about? And because of that, you're not sure which of the answers is correct. Well, the appropriate strategy for such questions is you use a process of elimination to make an educated guess. And so what that might look like is, let's say you're given a question and you are supposed to choose between option A through D. In a scenario like that, you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting the question right, even if you just guessed. Now, but because you have some idea of the topic but not 100% knowledge of it, you're likely going to be able to eliminate 1 or 2 of the answers which you know for sure are not the correct answer. And so for most people, you will be able to increase your chances from just 25% to 50% or maybe even higher by eliminating the obviously wrong questions. So let's look at how an example of using the process of elimination might look. You are given a question. You are asked to find the opposite of an incredibly long word which you'd never seen before. I'm not even going to try and pronounce this word, but suffice to say, this is actually a real word. Now, you're not going to get a question this difficult on the JAMB, but still, even if you happen to get a question like this and you knew almost nothing about the word, what you could do is try to make an educated guess. So let's see how that might actually work. Next slide. First, we know we're being asked to find the opposite of the word. The second thing we know is when we look closely at the word, it starts with the prefix honor, so or honorific. And so based on that, I'm just going to take an educated guess and I'm going to assume that this word has something to do with honor. And so since we're asked to find the opposite of a word that has something to do with honor, since honor is a good thing, the opposite is going to be a bad thing. And so if we go through the list of possible answers, we can immediately eliminate A, which is trustworthy, and B, which is believable, because those two words have a positive feeling or connotation to them. Whereas corrupt and unfamiliar are words that have a negative connotation to them. And so even though we don't know which of the answers is correct, we can say for sure it's not A and B. So now we've increased our chances from 1 out of 4 to 1 out of 2. And this demonstrates how the process of elimination can be used for questions for which you just have a rough idea of what the answer might be. So let's discuss another technique related to the process of elimination that you can also use on the exam. The second process of elimination technique that you can use is one where you take advantage of a very well-known fact. Any question that you are given that has multiple options, you can be sure that there can only be one correct answer. And so if you have 2 answers which are identical or too similar to each other, then you can assume that none of those 2 answers are the same. For example, if it was a math test and you were asked to find the answer of 1 plus 1, if option A was 3 and option B was 6 divided by 2, then you know that A and B cannot be true because A and B are both equal to 3. So if you have 2 answers that are equal to each other, you know that neither of those 2 can be correct because there can only be one correct answer. So using that same type of logic, you can begin to assume that trustworthy and believable Those words are very, very similar. They have a very similar meaning. And so you should already start suspecting that those two answers cannot be correct. So this is a great way to eliminate incorrect answers, even if you don't have a clear idea which answer is correct. Now that we've talked about strategies of how to deal with questions for which you have some idea but not enough knowledge to solve directly, let's look at an even more challenging scenario. So in this scenario, we're going to look at questions for which you know nothing about. These are questions for which you have you have no educated guess that you can take that will increase your chances, and you're left with seemingly no options. In this kind of situation, I recommend that you do not leave the questions blank. It is in your best interest to pick something. Whatever you pick gives you a chance better than zero of scoring points. So if you're given options A through D, then you have a 25% chance of getting some points on that question. And so if you had 4 questions that you didn't know anything about, there's a good chance you'll get one of those correct. And if you're lucky, maybe 2 or 3, just by taking a wild guess and guessing anything for the answer. So the most important lesson that I want you to take away from this category 3 type of questions is never leave any question blank. Even if you don't know what the answer is, you are helping yourself by guessing. So now let's look at what happens in category 4. So category 4 is an unfortunate scenario that does happen to us once in a while, where we are running out of time and there are many questions left to take that we feel there's a chance we might know some of those answers, but because maybe we have 1 or 2 minutes left, there's no way we're going to be able to solve them properly. So in those type of scenarios, again, do not leave any of the questions blank. Use the same strategy you use for category 3 questions. Just go through and take wild guesses. And wild guesses, it's up to you what strategy you want to use. If you want to select the same letter for everything, or you want to choose random letters, that's up to you to decide. The important thing, again, is you don't leave any questions blank. I'm aware that there were some rumors going around last year that people who guess answers will be punished in some way. That rumor is just not true. Take an educated guess if you know something about the question, and if you don't, just take a wild guess. Now, before I close, let me portray a realistic scenario to give you an idea of the power of the lessons that I've been teaching you thus far. So let's imagine a scenario. We have 2 people, Jimo and Ngozi. They are 2 equally smart jambites. They're going to take 4 tests on their JAMB exam. Let's just say English, physics, math, and chemistry. And on their first test, since they're both equally smart, they knew 40 out of the 50 questions with total confidence. But of course, just because they were confident in those questions doesn't mean they got all of them right. So they got 3 out of 4 of those questions right. So that is 30 out of the 40 questions that they were confident about, they got correct. Then, in the case of Ngozi, there were some questions that she was somewhat confident about, and so she was able to get 1 out of 2 of those questions. But then there were 8 questions which she was totally unable to solve and did not know what the answer was. Ngozi chose to leave the answers blank. In the case of Jimo, he did everything that Ngozi did, but except that when he got to the questions he knew nothing about, he decided to take some wild guesses. And fortunately for him, he got 2 out of the 8 questions correct. So, what is the difference in their performance? Well, you might be saying, well, Ngozi gets 62 out of 100 on the exam, and Jimo gets 66 out of 100. So what's the big deal? It's just 4 points. That's not going to make the difference between her or him going into the school of choice that they have selected for each other. But let's think about what happens if they repeat the same behavior for the 4 tests that they have to take that day. Now, Ngozi has a score of 248 and Jima has a score of 264. And again, these are 2 people who are equally intelligent, but one of them is scoring 16 points more than the other. And that is a significant difference that could actually affect their admissions. So the moral of the story is that you should apply these techniques on any exam that you take because every point counts.